Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to Living History and the fifth and last in our special series on the D-Day landing beaches. Now, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, please go back and do that because it'll be pretty essential for your understanding of what we're talking about. We've talked about Omaha and Utah beaches in the US sector. We've talked about Gold and Sword beaches in the British sector. And today we're going to talk about the one that's sandwiched in between Gold and Sword. It's the Canadian beach. Perhaps the one that gets a little bit overlooked in the grand scheme of things. I don't want to preempt too much, but joining us to talk about it is historian Mike Bechthold. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks, Matt. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about Juno with you.
I think it's really important the way that we've done this, Mike, because D-Day was a collaborative effort. I think if you go and walk the ground, you could be forgiven for thinking it's mostly an American story. If you sit down with your British mates and talk about it, they'll tell you that the Americans, were the minor part. It was a British operation. And the poor old Canadians are getting a little bit overlooked entirely, I think. But over the previous episodes, we've discussed what a collaborative effort it was, that there was about 3,000 Australians who participated in D-Day, mostly in the air and in the seas. There were Poles. There were obviously French commandos landing on the beaches. It just was New Zealanders. It was a huge collaborative effort, and I think that's why the Canadian story is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably about, and maybe the best place to start is about 30 years ago, there was a group of Canadian veterans that went back to Normandy for the anniversary, and they were walking around Normandy. And of course, there were signs of the Canadian involvement on Juno Beach. But as soon as you got off the beaches out of the little villages of Courseulles-sur-Mer and Bernières-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, the traces of Canada disappeared. And in fact, they got to a place called the Abbé d'Ardennes, which was a really key place for the Canadians in the Battle of Normandy, a place where Kurt Meyer and his 12th SS executed some 22 Canadians during the battle, had been taken over by the Americans, and they were a little aghast. So they set their mind to it and formed a foundation called the Canadian Battle of Normandy Foundation that was all about honoring and remembering the Canadian commitment in Normandy. And so over the last 30 years, they have done fundraising. They run an annual battlefield tour to Normandy for Canadian university students, and they've made sure that the Canadian role in Normandy hasn't been forgotten. And I think not just to them, but for a bunch of reasons, that's been largely successful. There's been a series of really good books written by Canadian historians on the Battle of Normandy. Terry Kopp and Mark Milner are two that come to the forefront, but there's many others. But I still think that the Canadians get second or maybe even third fiddle to the British and American story in Normandy.
Is the story of D-Day well remembered in Canada itself? And the reason I ask that question is if we go to somewhere like Gallipoli, where the French paid a huge price fighting and get a little bit overlooked in the story, the people who overlook them the most are the French themselves, who are distracted by things that were happening elsewhere in the world. So do Canadians relate strongly to their story of D-Day?
I don't think they relate strongly to it. I think if you were going to ask Canadians about their military history, Vimy Ridge would be the thing that would be the most recognizable to them. Names like Billy Bishop from the First World War, the Canadian fighter ace, might be knowledgeable. Not too far down the list is Juno, but I think a lot of the recognition would really just be that it was a place where Canadians fought at some point. Maybe they could identify it was the Second World War, maybe not. But I'm not sure that there's a wide recognition of what happened, how important a site it was for Canadians, and how crucial the Canadian contribution and sacrifice was there.
Well, we do have a decent number of Canadian listeners on this podcast, so hopefully we're going to teach them some things they didn't know, but also bring this story to a much wider audience. So why don't we start?
Well, Matt, I'm sure your listeners are batting above the average and certainly know a lot more than the average Joe here.
We might be singing to the choir a little bit, but that's why we love our audience. Let's start there. Let's go back a little bit more before we get to what happened on Juno Beach. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Canada's involvement in the Second World War up to this point?
Sure. So coming into the Second World War, Canada had paid for a reputation as a military nation in the First World War, largely through the sacrifices of the Canadian Corps on the Western Front. And the Canadians, along with the Australians, emerged from that war as the shock troops of the British Army. They were among the best, most effective, most efficient troops fighting on the Western Front. And I know there's some British historians that would like to go to war with me for saying that, but by and large, the Canadians and the Australians were the most effective troops on the Western Front. All of that military knowledge, know-how had mostly been lost in the interwar years. As soon as the Canadians came home, they disbanded the Corps. All the experience was lost, and the military went down to a very, very basic level. And when the Second World War came on the horizon, the Canadians had to build up almost from zero. The professional army was very small. The professional air force was very small. And at the start of the war, our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, thought that he really wanted to avoid any kind of contribution like the fighting on the Western Front, to avoid that slaughter in the trenches again. So he went to support a program called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. He thought that we could put our money and our effort and our personnel into training pilots for the air war that was to come. And in some ways, that was perhaps Canada's most important contribution to the Second World War. Some $2 billion in 1940s dollars was spent on this program. 131,000 aircrew were trained, more than half of them Canadians, who made a huge impact on the air war. But we couldn't avoid fighting in the ground, and ultimately 5 Canadian divisions were raised to fight in Northwest Europe. Initially 3 in France and 2 in Italy, but by the time the Corps had got to Holland in 1945, the entire Canadian Army was reunited, and all 5 divisions were fighting together. This is a pretty impressive accomplishment for what was a very small nation at the time. The population of Canada in 1939 was 11 million people. But by 1944, there were some 1 million people in uniform, both men and women, not quite 1 in 10 of the overall population. So that's a huge commitment. And large segments of the population were committed to war industry, whether it's making tanks, mining aluminum, smelting it, building aircraft or trucks or farming. It was a national effort on a scale that had never been seen in Canada before. So that was sort of the basics of the Canadian war effort. Our entry onto the fighting was much slower. While our airmen got into the fight a little bit earlier, the Canadian Army went to England in 1939, and there it sat. While the British were fighting at Dunkirk and on the continent, while the Australians and New Zealanders and British were fighting in the Western Desert in 1940 and 41, the Canadians were sitting in the UK. And they had an important role. They were sort of the main defensive troops guarding against a possible German invasion. So they did have a role, but there was a lot of talk. Why weren't the Canadians fighting? Why weren't they doing their bit? Why weren't they involved in the fighting and dying like all of their Commonwealth brethren? So in 1942, when the Dieppe raid was put forward, there's been a lot of talk that the British sacrificed the Canadians at Dieppe. Of course, Dieppe was that great raid on the 19th of August, 1942, that ultimately proved to be a huge failure. Some 900 plus Canadians died that day out of the 5,000 men that landed. And it was a huge failure. And there was some talk that, well, the British would never have done that with their own troops. They sent the Canadians because they didn't care about the Canadians or whatever narrative you want to spin. The truth is really quite different. The Canadians were eager to go. They wanted to go. Everyone from the Prime Minister, who was receiving a lot of criticism from his electorate about why the Canadians weren't involved, wanted them to go. The Canadian generals, McNaughton and Crerar, wanted to get their men into the fight. And the men themselves were itching to go. They wanted to do their bit. They were all volunteers. Right up until late 1944, every single Canadian soldier, airman and sailor in the Second World War was a volunteer. And they wanted to do their bit. So they were all keen to go to Dieppe. After that, there wasn't much going on for the Canadians. The 1st Division was sent to Sicily in July 1943, and subsequently the 5th Armored Division joined them later in 43, which left behind 3 Canadian divisions in England for the upcoming invasion of Europe. 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was the most trained, the most prepared, so it was designated as the Assault Division and given a key role on D-Day.
Given what a mess the Dieppe landing had been, was there an element of trying to regain some trust with the Brits about the efficacy of seaborne landings?
Yeah, it's interesting because generals and historians since have tried to draw a direct line of connection between Dieppe and D-Day. Because Dieppe failed, because of the lessons learned, we were able to succeed on the 6th of June, 1944. And it's not wrong to say that, but it is really overly simplified to say that. I think the connection is because it was Canadians in both, because they were both invasions on the English Channel, the English coast. But it fails to take into advance the almost 2 years of amphibious operations the Allies engaged in, Operation Torch, Operation to land in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, not to mention everything that took place in the Pacific in terms of developing what was going on. So yes, you can really look at the things that failed at Dieppe and see how they were fixed, or mostly fixed by D-Day, but it wasn't a straight line to making that happen. Of course, the generals wanted to make that connection. General Crerar, who was the commander of 1st Canadian Army, in his message to the troops on D-Day, mentioned the sacrifice of your brothers at Dieppe as inspiration for your coming success and things like that. So that kind of comparison has been baked into the literature for 80 years now, but I think you have to be careful in making those connections.
Well, let's talk about the Canadian involvement in D-Day. And we should mention at this stage that, of course, it wasn't just on the ground, that there was a lot of Canadian airmen participating and sailors and everyone as well, but we are going to focus on the landing beaches as part of this episode. So Juno Beach is sort of sandwiched in between the 2 British landing beaches of Gold and Sword. paint us a picture of what the Canadians were going to be facing on that beach. Firstly, let's start with the geography, because Mike, I've been fascinated as we've done this journey that each beach seems quite different from the others, and the nature of the fighting was quite different. The challenges presented to the landing troops were quite different from one another. Talk to us about what the Canadians faced at Juno.
Yeah, for sure. So Juno Beach itself is about 8 kilometers in length, about 5 miles from a village known as Courseulles-sur-Mer in the west, all the way to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer in the east, and in between is the village of Bernières-sur-Mer. The beaches are wonderful, wide, sandy beaches, ideal for landing on, easy to get across. There's none of the geographic challenges of Omaha, which had those high bluffs behind it, which caused so many problems. But the Germans also recognized that it was a very exposed position, and so it was very well defended. Elements of the German 7th 16th Division were garrisoning the Juno sector, and in particular they had a number of strong points along that coastline, 2 at Courseulles, 1 at Bernières, and 1 at Saint-Aubin, that were quite well defended. Courseulles itself was bisected by the Soule River, so it was a small port, and the river added a little bit of complexity into it. But I think when you're looking at the geography of Juno, it's really important to look beyond the beaches to understand what is further inland. And there's been a lot of criticism of the Allies for not looking inland and seeing the bocage, for instance, and planning for that. I'm not quite sure how much that is the case. Maybe they underestimated that, but they were definitely looking inland at Juno. And the thing the Allied planners were most worried about were the German panzer divisions and the threat they would pose from a massive counterattack. So there was a wide plain that sort of led from the city of Caen, which is just inland from the D-Day beaches, west of Caen, up almost straight to Juno. And it was sort of the widest, most open part of the D-Day bridgehead. And Allied planners looked at that and said, if we were the Germans, if we were going to mount an armored counterattack, this is the avenue we were going to take. And they were absolutely 100% right, because the Germans looked at the geography in exactly the same way. And when the time came, they were prepared to launch a major armored counterattack right at Juno Beach through that corridor that the Allies had envisioned. Now, that being the case, the Allies planned for that. So the Canadian 3rd Division went in loaded for bear. They were, as Mark Milner shows in his fabulous book, Stopping the Panzers, they were the designated panzer-killing division on D-Day. So they had everything that a regular British Canadian infantry division would have. But then as well, they had additional anti-tank units. They had additional artillery units, and they were prepared to get ashore, dig in, and defeat in detail those expected German counterattacks. And as it panned out, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what the Canadians did from about the 7th to the 10th or 11th of June.
You mentioned the German defenses. Were the Germans employing the same sort of tactics they'd used further west at Omaha, where they had emplacements with guns, enfilading the beach and spread out, defensive positions? Was that the same situation at Juno?
Yeah, for sure. Depends how you count these things. Omaha was certainly the most well-defended sector on of the D-Day beaches, but Juno wasn't too far behind it. I think probably it was more well-defended than Sword, which was also well defended, but I think there was a little bit more guns and firepower in the Juno sector. So, for instance, at Courseulles, where the 7th Canadian Brigade was landing, there were I think about 6 main bunker complexes that had an 88 millimeter gun. There was 2 75 millimeter guns and 2 50 millimeter anti-tank guns. Any one of those guns could easily destroy a landing craft or a Sherman tank landing on the beach in front of them. And in addition, there was probably about a dozen concrete encased machine gun positions And that doesn't take into account the barbed wire, the trenches, the minefields, and everything like that. And then the real defenses for the Germans was, of course, artillery. And they had artillery positions behind the beaches and 81 millimeter mortar positions as well. And the Germans, being the good soldiers that they are, they had everything cataloged, everything into a grid. So when a landing craft would land, they could say fire on grid C9, and they wouldn't have to do much more than tweak their artillery or mortars and be able to bring down fire very quickly and very directly at any point on the beaches.
How did you actually sleep last night? If it didn't feel like your very best rest, then you need to upgrade to the softest, most luxurious bedding from Boll & Branch. Their signature sheets are made from the finest 100% organic cotton and get softer with every wash. Millions of sleepers love their sheets, and right now, you can feel the difference for yourself during their biggest sales of the entire year. Hurry to bollandbranch.com to shop their best offers. Limited time only. Exclusions apply. See site for details.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
And were the Canadians employing some of these ingenious tactics, such as floating tanks and these sorts of things? Did they come ashore at Juno as well as at other beaches?
Yeah, just like at all the beaches, the D-Day landings were remarkably complex in terms of how they were planning to deal with the German defenses. I think that if you talked to the infantry beforehand, they probably weren't told that there is going to be so much firepower directed at the Germans that you're just going to have to walk ashore and take possession of the beaches. I don't think anybody ever told them that, but that was kind of the expectation, because the amount of firepower put on those beach or expected to be put on those beach defenses was absolutely devastating. Everything from American 4-engine bombers started early, dropping their bombs on the Juno sector. That was followed up by medium bombers dropping their bombs on the defenses. The air bombardment was followed up by naval bombardment, and there were dozens of big gun ships, mostly RN and Royal Canadian Navy ships out there, battleships, monitors, cruisers, destroyers, with everything from 14 or 16-inch guns down to 5-inch guns that are firing point blank at the targets on the beaches. There were specialized landing craft that had direct fire guns that were attacking the defenses. There were landing craft that had rockets, essentially the same 3-inch rocket that the rocket-firing Typhoon used. Were in the dozens on these landing craft, and they would fire them up as a big barrage that were primarily to deal with minefields, explode the minefields and everything like that. And then just before the troops actually set down, the Typhoons and other fighters came in and made one last attack. So with all that bombardment, you would have thought that the Germans couldn't possibly have survived, but in fact they did, and they did for a number of reasons. The concrete positions they had were very well defended, and anything except for a direct hit wouldn't cause much problems. I think in the Canadian sector there was only one 75 millimeter gun bunker that was knocked out by a direct shell or bomb hit. Everything else survived. A lot of the bombing was long. It was dropped in the fields behind the thickest of the defenses for good reason. The bombers were told to hold their fire if they weren't sure. Worst thing they could do was drop short and drop it on the landing craft in the water. So they wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So as a result, a lot of the bombs were dropped in the fields and probably annoyed a lot of Norman cows, but didn't do much more than that. There's an entry in the War Diary of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles that I think is particularly telling. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed right in front of the main strong point in Courseulles-sur-Mer. In fact, right where the Juno Beach Museum is located today. And they had a particularly tough time about it. And their entry in the War Diary marked at 07:49, so 10 to 8 in the morning, when their first troops landed, said that in spite of air bombardment failing to neutralize, Royal Naval bombardment spotty, the rockets falling short, and the AVREs and DDs, those are the tanks and similar craft coming ashore, C Company of the Canadian Scottish Regiment and the Royal Winnipeg Rifle Companies all landed within 7 minutes. The bombardment, having failed to kill a single German soldier or silence one weapon, these companies had to storm their positions cold and did so without hesitation. I think that is absolutely telling in that in a bunch of different ways, because the Allies had all this firepower that was meant to destroy the German defenses, and it didn't. I think it's fair to say that it did suppress them. I think it cut off those German bunkers from their command and control apparatus that were further inland, cut telephone lines, made radio communication difficult, isolated the positions, made it difficult to get reinforcements forward, ammunition resupply, and so forth. But by and large, very few Germans were killed and very little destruction of defensive weapons was caused by all that bombardment, which means that it was the average infantry soldier splashing ashore, carrying his rifle or his Bren gun or his Sten gun that had to charge into the face of those machine guns and get the job done. And the courage and heroics of these men in doing this, it just boggles my mind. Like, I like to think, would I be able to do that? And I don't know if I could. I don't know if I could, but these boys, a lot of them were 18, 19, 20 years old, had been training for years. They were in absolute tip-top physical condition. They knew their jobs inside and out, and they had one goal that day, and that was to get ashore to kill or capture the Germans and secure the beachhead. And they got that job done. And it's really one of the more remarkable stories of the entire Second World War.
Well, it's quite an extraordinary entry in the War Diary, not just describing a perilous situation, but incredible writing as well. It was quite passionate and very well put together. I really admire that you don't see that often in war diaries. Let's talk about that great achievement, Mike. Let's get to the core of the story when the Canadians hit those beaches and came ashore.
Yeah, for sure. So Juno Beach was the target of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Essentially, they had 2 of their 3 infantry brigades up. Each infantry brigade of 3 battalions had 2 of the 3 battalions in the assault, and each of the battalions had 2 of their companies, 2 of their 4 companies in the leading assault. So I know that's a lot of numbers and sort of order of battle stuff, but it was a lot of firepower going ashore in terms of infantry. Now, they were supported by 2 armored regiments that were coming ashore with the duplex drive Sherman tanks. Those were the tanks that had the screen that went up around them so that they could sail ashore under their own power. The 1st Hussars of London, Ontario were supporting 7th Brigade at Courseulles-sur-Mer, and they sailed ashore without too much trouble. They lost about 5 tanks that sank in the rough seas that day. And in fact, if you go to Courseulles today, there's a Sherman DD tank called Bold that sits in the main square at Courseulles. And that was one of those Canadian Shermans that sank on D-Day. And it was found and brought to the surface in about 1970. And it's sat in Courseulles as a monument ever since then. At Bernières-sur-Mer, it was the Fort Garry Horse was the armored regiment that was supporting that. And that regiment decided that it was too wavy. The sea conditions were too rough for the DD tanks. So the tank landing craft came almost ashore, and the war diary for the regiment describes it as a wet wade ashore for those tanks rather than sailing ashore. But all those tanks got ashore, and they were absolutely essential in subduing the German defenses. Now, they weren't the only armor that was ashore on the Canadian beaches. Elements of the British 79th Armored Division was also there with their funnies, especially the AVREs, the Armored Vehicle Royal Engineer. And this was a Churchill tank, which is an infantry support tank. It's slow, ponderous, but very heavily armored. And the AVRE, instead of having a 75 millimeter gun like a standard Churchill, had what was known as a petard, which was also known as the dustbin. And it was this short, stubby barrel that fired an enormous shell of high explosives that was not very long range, but it was designed to knock out bunkers. And these AVREs were very effective at Juno Beach and helped the Canadians immensely. I think it's worth saying that by the end of the 6th of June, some 21,000 men had landed on Juno Beach. 14,000 of those were Canadians, but there were some 7,000 Brits that landed as well, and they were absolutely crucial to the success at Juno. As I'd mentioned, some of them were part of the 79th Armored Division. There were 2 beach support groups that landed, Berkshire, 7th Berkshire Regiment, and I can't remember the other one. In fact, if you look at any pictures of the Canadians, I'll put Canadians in quotation marks on D-Day, and you see the troops with a white circle, a white band on their helmets. Well, those are in fact the British support troops that are there to help organize things, direct traffic, deal with prisoners of war, and all those other tasks that had to be accomplished on the beach after the fighting had moved further inland. There was also British Royal Engineers. There were 48 Royal Marine Commando landed at Saint-Aubin shortly after the Canadians and had a big role to play in capturing Saint-Aubin, the village itself. So, it was a Canadian story, but it wasn't exclusively a Canadian story.
I remember speaking to a British veteran of D-Day, and I think he was an artilleryman, but I was a bit confused because he told me he came ashore at Juno, and I was in my ignorance, I was saying that can't be right. That's a Canadian beach. So I learned a history lesson firsthand from a veteran. But I think it's a great point you make, and as we've said time and time again in this series, the collaborative effort of the Allies. This wasn't a British landing or an American landing. This was an Allied landing, and the Canadians were well supported.
Yeah, very much so. The very first time I went to Normandy was in 1995 as a part of that Canadian Battle of Normandy Foundation student tour. I was a student on the tour at that point, and we arrived at Saint-Aubin on the 6th of June, and were really surprised to see a British ceremony taking place. And it was about 20 veterans of the Royal Marines who had landed there on D-Day, and they were all lined up, and the local French people were there, and they had flags flying, and they had the local band and everything like that. And it was a really neat ceremony because we weren't expected to be there or planning to be there. We just kind of happened upon it, and they were happy to welcome us in. And it was interesting because they at one point in the ceremony they played the national anthem. So they started with the Canadian national anthem, and the French band did a good job getting through it. Then they played the God Save the Queen and did a great job. And then all of a sudden they launched into La Marseillaise, and it was rip roaring, and they were stamping their feet, and it was just like the best thing they had ever played. And it was really neat to see. But we really scratched our heads at first because like, why are these British veterans here on our Juno Beach? What are they doing? And of course we figured out that it wasn't just our beach, it was their beach too.
Well, we as the former colonials tend to do what we can to downplay the involvement of the Brits a lot of the times. I mean, I'm mostly a First World War guy, and we see that time and time again that there were large numbers of British men serving in the Australian forces, in the Canadian forces, and all the former colonial forces. I mean, during it's a little bit of an aside, but it was a huge time of travel as well for people. The First and Second World Wars. This was not a time when people were stuck at home. People were roaming all over the empire. So you often find some quite curious nationalities embedded with national forces, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess the Royal Air Force is the best example of that, it might be a Royal Air Force squadron. It might be a Royal Australian Air Force squadron. But if you look at the crew of an individual Lancaster or Halifax, it might be a British pilot and a Canadian navigator and a British bombardier. And they were really common. The Royal Air Force was really a Commonwealth Air Force in many ways, with all the parts, whether it be Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, South African, or British, being interchangeable and used in a plug-and-play manner. And I think that's really impressive.
Well, notwithstanding the collaborative effort, the Canadians themselves did some pretty remarkable things at Juno. I mean, talk to me about casualties, because they didn't get out of this lightly, did they?
No, for sure. And I think before we talk about casualties, I just wanted to maybe bring up something that your listeners would be able to identify with, and that's Saving Private Ryan. I think that film is one of the classics of cinema dealing with D-Day. I was when I first saw it, I was absolutely blown away with the reality of it and how well they had captured the D-Day story and the experience of the Americans in Normandy. And I still remember those first scenes where Tom Hanks' Rangers land at Omaha and they're coming ashore and the beach is packed and it is noisy and there's nowhere to go and everything like that. And I think in many ways that has flooded into the consciousness as this was the D-Day experience, whether you were American, British, Canadian, or Free French, whoever else was landing, this was what it was like on a D-Day beach. And I think it's important to point out that was a very particular American experience at Omaha, that the other beaches weren't like that. And I think the best example I can give of that is Company Sergeant Major Charlie Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, who landed at Bernier-sur-Mer. And he talks about D-Day being one of the loneliest moments of his life. He was in the spearhead of the Queen's Own, landing at Bernier. He was on a landing craft with about 30 or 35 of his men in his company, B company of the Queen's Own. And he said it was the seas weren't too rough, but they were a little rougher than they expected. But it was misty and foggy and smoky from the German gunfire and the Allied gunfire. And he said that looking off to his left, he could barely see the next landing craft in the line about 100 meters away. So more than a football pitch length away from him. On his right, it was the same. The next landing craft was more than 100 yards to his right. And that at that moment when they touched down in France and the front of the landing craft went down and him and his men charged off into France, he said there was nobody else around them. And it seemed like it was him and his men alone attacking the Germans to liberate France. And he said it was a very peculiar experience. And he said around him, his men were getting shot and dying, but they had one singular aim, and that was to get off the beach. And they kept charging forward and did it until they got themselves to safety behind the beach wall, and then began dealing with the German positions around them. But for the longest time, it was just him and his men alone against the might of the German army. And that's a very different experience than what was portrayed in Steven Spielberg's film.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've said this a couple of times during the series that, and people have heard me say this on the podcast a lot, but every man's war is a different experience depending on what he was up to. And John McManus, when he was talking about Omaha, was stressing the point that even at Omaha, yes, in some sectors it was that horrific Saving Private Ryan experience, but other men got ashore quite easily. So it depended on the time and place where you hit those beaches. I think that's important, as we say. Every man's war is the 6 feet in front of him, and I think that description you just gave there illustrates that perfectly, Mike. And so, how many Canadians were killed or wounded during that landing?
So, casualty figures are difficult. Mostly in the same way as they are at Omaha, because we can't say how many men fell on Juno Beach. I can tell you that there were 340 Canadians killed on the 6th of June. We can infer that probably the vast majority of them were fighting and dying on Juno Beach or cleaning out the seaside villages. But of course, the fighting didn't stop as soon as they got ashore. For the Canadians, they kept fighting inland. They liberated a number of other villages, Grey-sur-Mer, moving towards Banville and Revier and other places like that. Spearheads of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Armored Regiment got as far south as the Cambrai rail line, which was designated as Objective Oak, which was the ultimate goal of all of the Anglo-Canadian divisions on D-Day, about 8 kilometers inland from the beach. But they kind of got there and looked around, and it's like, hey, where is everybody else? They're not here. So they turned around and went back. But there was fighting that was going on all day long. So yeah, 340 Canadians died on D-Day, but we don't know how many of those were actually on Juno Beach. Another almost 600 were wounded, and almost 50 were taken prisoner of war during those early hours of the invasion as well. So significant casualties. And then to that, again, I don't have clarity on the British numbers in the way I do for the Canadians, but about 243 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured on D-Day. So that's about a third of what the Canadians took overall. So pretty significant, especially considering that they weren't the spearhead troops for the most part. They were the service troops, the supporting troops, spending the time on the beachhead. But they took some pretty serious casualties there as well.
Yeah, it was surprisingly bloody landing at Juno, especially compared to, not to take anything away, there were no easy beaches, but some of the sectors of the British beaches, the troops came ashore relatively unscathed. So they suffered at Juno. They did indeed.
Yeah, Utah and Gold were different experiences. Kind of luck of the draw. They were able to land maybe where the Germans weren't as strong, not landing in the thick of it. For the Queen Zone, they had a misfortune in it at Bernier. They were supposed to have their 2 companies landing on either side of the village, going past the village and then coming and attacking it from behind. But because of the wind and sea states, the one company, I think it was B Company, was pushed and landed directly in front of Bernier, right into the teeth of the strong point, and took some fairly serious casualties as a result. Queen Zone had the highest casualties of any Canadian regiment on D-Day. It was 61 men were killed and another 82 were wounded. Second behind that were the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. It landed right into the strong point at Courseulles-sur-Mer. They had 57 killed and another 71 that were wounded. In fact, B Company, by the end of the day on the 6th of June, was down to 1 officer and 26 men, which is a pretty substantial rate of casualties. And basically that company was out of the battle for the next week. Like, it was fighting, but it had to be substantially rebuilt almost from scratch to become part of the line of battle.
I think I'm correct in saying that the casualties in Juno was the second highest of D-Day behind what happened at Omaha. I think that's the case.
I think so. And I've had it said to me that even though the absolute numbers of casualties were higher at Omaha, that perhaps the Canadian percentages were higher in terms of percentage of men committed versus men killed and wounded, compared to the much higher number of men who landed at Omaha. I don't know if that's true, but that does make sense in one sense, in terms of the much larger number. I mean, it was 2 divisions plus that landed at Omaha compared to a reinforced division for the Canadians.
Well, it does tell a story, and it's a story of great heroism. It's a story that is a little bit overlooked. Even I'll say it even from my Australian position, the story of the Canadians is overlooked. Mike, we like to end these episodes with a philosophical question. It's the 80th anniversary of D-Day. After all this time, after nearly a century, how should we remember the Canadian contribution to D-Day?
That's a really good question, and thanks for that. I think how I'll approach that is I'll return to Saving Private Ryan, and when the film was released here in Canada, there was a piece in our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, where the writer opined that if Saving Private Ryan had been about the Canadians, Private Ryan would have been killed. His rescue squad would have been squished by tiger tanks, and nobody would have made it off the beach. And that's an interesting comment about how Canadians view their history and how we look at our heroes. For some reason, we don't like to celebrate military feats. I guess I get it. I mean, Canada likes to project itself as a peacekeeping nation, a nation that does Blue Beret, sort of helping others. But I would argue that our role in the Second World War was exactly that. It was a war that we didn't have to participate in, but that we chose to because the stakes were so high. As Churchill had said, it was one of the most monstrous tyrannies in all human history. It was about Hitler trying to change the world to impose his will. And Canadians might not have known the details of it at the time, but they knew that what Hitler was trying to do was wrong and had to be stopped. And they were willing to volunteer and go overseas and fight and die in very large numbers to do that. And I think that's something that's maybe been lost today in terms of our understanding of military history. I can't tell you how many times I've been told by people when they ask, what do I do? And I say, oh, I'm a military history. And they say, oh, you must like war. And I'm like, no, nothing could be further from the truth. I hate war. I hate everything about it. But just because I hate it doesn't mean we should ignore it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't study it and understand it and try to see what it can show us about A, who we are as a people, and B, maybe inform our thinking on things that are going on today. So there was a book written by a famous Canadian military historian years ago called Canadian Soldiers, A Military History of an Unmilitary People. And I would argue quite differently that, in fact, we are a military people, that we are not rah-rah gung-ho in the way that the Americans are, but that we are there in times of need when things need to be done, whether it be in the First World War, in the Second World War, in Korea for peacekeeping operations, or right forward to today where we've got a battle group in Latvia holding down things at the front. We are there to get things done when they need to be. We're not a country of imperialism. We're not a country that goes out to conquer others, but we will stand and fight to protect your rights. And I think that's been lost, and it shouldn't be.
That's very well said, Mike. And I tell you what, my study of the First World War and the Second World War indicates that if I was a German soldier, I would not want to come up against a Canadian on the battlefield. They, time and time again, just some of the toughest troops on the battlefield. And as an aside, I should also say, being a First World War guy, some of the most wonderful memorials on the Western Front battlefields are the Canadian ones. And we always make sure when we do an Australian tour even to include some of those Canadian sites, because just extraordinary memorials telling an extraordinary story. And that's really what we've heard today, Mike. It's been absolutely extraordinary. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. It's been absolutely brilliant. And if you're keen, we'll definitely get you back on the show again at a future date to talk more about Canada's amazing military history.
Oh, my pleasure, Matt. It's been a lot of fun today, and I'd love to come back and chat with you again.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.
We all have our own behind-the-wheel persona. Are you a windows-down, sing-along to your favorite song, seat-lean-back kind of driver? Or perhaps an AC-blasting, podcast-on, hugging-the-wheel kind of driver? However you move through life, Atlantic Union Bank is on board, because we agree things should be done your way, especially banking. Work with someone you trust who's there when you need them for all the ways you bank. Call, schedule a video appointment, or make a pit stop at an Atlantic Union Bank branch to learn more. Atlantic Union Bank, any way you bank.